And I've done these kinds of surveys quite a bit, asking people, what's your one big question for God? And I've never done it without having this question being the number one. Always, always, always. And it's always the number one by a huge margin. It's always the biggest question of all the big questions. We want to know, if God is good, why is there so much bad in the world? And before I go about giving some thoughts from the Bible, I thought it'd be good, as we come to the end of this week, to say one thing about questions and answers, and it's this. Christians have a lot of questions that are unanswered. I've got a lot of questions that are unanswered. I've got loads of big questions myself for God, and everyone in this room, whether they're Christian or not, we've all got big questions for God. And the way you become a Christian is not by answering every single question that you've ever, thought about and ticking them all off on the list until you've had all your 800 million questions answered, and then you can become a Christian. Because we've been saying throughout this week that actually a relationship with Jesus, it's a little bit like kind of a married relationship. It's a bit like sort of getting to know someone special in your life. And it would be a strange relationship with somebody, wouldn't it? That if the way you got to know them was with a pen and a clipboard and 17 questions, each more tricky than the last, that would not be a relationship that lasted very long, would it? How do you get to know somebody? You get to know somebody by entering into their world, and they enter into your world, and you spend time with them, they spend time with you. And yeah, you ask a whole bunch of questions, but those questions come in the context of a much bigger relationship. And then at some stage, maybe you get to trust that special someone so much that you stand at the front of church at some point and you say, I do, to that other person. And all of a sudden, you get married and you become one with this other person. Now, I'm someone who's gotten married. Did I know everything about my wife when I got married? No. Did she know everything about me when she married me? Thankfully, no. I kept it all hidden until she was stupid enough to marry me. And then I let the cat out of the bag. And it's, you drop the mask and you start, farting in their presence. And it doesn't matter because, they're married now. Can't get out of it. So this is what happens. And then they start to ask the big questions about you, right? And then my wife starts to ask, who are you? Who raised you? Who lives like this? All the big questions actually happen on the inside of the relationship. And it's the same with Christianity. Like if you're not a Christian, you might think you've got some big questions for Jesus now, right? But if you are in a relationship with Him forever, you'd have even bigger questions, right? Because it matters even more. And you're in this relationship, and you better sort this sort of stuff out. So what I want to say to you is, don't feel like you've got to have every single answer to every single question you've ever had in order to be a Christian. All you need to do is to be able to trust the other person. Like when I married Emma, I didn't know everything, but I knew enough to trust her. And maybe through your asking questions and through some of the answers that the Bible gives, maybe you've got to the point where you start to think, I don't know everything, but maybe I know enough to trust Him. Maybe I can trust the things I don't know to Him, because what I do see in Jesus is trustworthy. That's kind of how it works to become a Christian. But tonight we're thinking about this big question, the biggest of big questions, the question of suffering. And I thought what we could do is have a look at a little video that went viral about a month ago when Stephen Fry asked his one big question to God. Should we have a look at that? Let's have a look at what Stephen Fry said. All right, that's what Stephen Fry said. And we're going to think about how Stephen Fry says some really good things there. And he gets a lot of stuff right, actually. He takes aim at a target and he kind of gives it, all his flamethrowers and his tanks and his bazookas, and he fires at this target. And you can feel his rage. And it's kind of a good rage. It's a righteous rage as he is angry at the problem of suffering. The big problem is, obviously, he's aiming at the enemy. He's aiming at not the God of the Bible, as we're about to see. So we'll think about what Stephen Fry says. We'll think about in a second how he gets many things right and how he gets some fundamental things quite wrong about that. But let's think about what the Bible has to say. Why is there suffering in the world? Now, it's really important, first of all, to say on this question that it matters hugely the way that you're asking this question. So on the next slide, how are we asking the question? On the next slide, we could be maybe in the philosophy department. Maybe any of you do like philosophy A level or something? Anybody do? Or no? No. Good. Okay. I did a philosophy degree. Don't worry about that. You could be asking the question really philosophically, or you could just be asking it in the playground, and you could just be asking it just as almost as a conversation piece, not as something that's really personal to you. Or you could be asking it because you're going through a heck of a lot of suffering right now, and it's really, really a hurtful kind of issue for you right now. Now, the way you answer that question, if you're in the philosophy department, if you're in a philosophy class, you answer it really, really differently to if someone is like, they've just lost their mum or something. That you answer the question in a massively different kind of way. And I'm not going to be able to answer your questions from all the different perspectives that people could ask them from. But what I want to do is show you that actually Jesus has an answer for suffering that meets you where you are. And the way we're going to think about it is by thinking about this next statement on the next slide. Yeah, where are we asking this question from? Are we asking this question in the comfortable West, or are we asking this question in the rest of the world? The rest of the world, like in Burundi, the rest of the world where 3 billion people on this planet earn less than $2 a day. Where are we asking this question from? Stephen Fry is an incredibly blessed man. Very, very rich, very artistically fulfilled, living one of the most charmed lives in the world. But most of the people in the world live in conditions that are far, far harder than Stephen Fry has ever seen in his life. And yet, in those places in the world, atheism is, in many parts of those places, atheism is even unheard of. It's interesting, in Australia, on the next slide, there was a bus campaign. Sometimes you get these sort of atheist bus campaigns. In Melbourne, they had this sign on a bus: "If God exists, I hope he has a good excuse." And I can, as an Australian, I can see that slogan and that sign would get a lot of people agreeing in Australia. Australia is a very, very comfortable country to live in. It's always ranked either first or second in the world in terms of the most comfortable places in the world to live. It's always either Norway or Australia in terms of living standards. It's a great, great place to live. And yet, it's a place where we're very, very likely to think nasty God needs a good excuse. Now, isn't that interesting? That in one of the nicest places in all the world, this is what we kind of think. I wonder how that bus would go driving through Burundi. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine this bus driving through Darfur, where Wim was last night? Can you imagine this bus driving through Baghdad? Can you imagine this bus driving through a slum in Brazil? No one in any of those places would have any idea what this is on about. People would be suffering there far more than we've ever imagined, and yet believe in a good God. And they have no problem with that whatsoever. Isn't it interesting that us in the West, we're so much more comfortable and we're so much more likely to shake our fist at God? That's just interesting. The guy who came up with that saying, "If God exists, I hope he has a good excuse," is Woody Allen. And again, he's led one of the most charmed lives in the world. Very rich, very famous, New York comedian and director. And he thinks nasty God needs a good excuse for what he's done with the world. I just think that's interesting. Isn't it interesting that we in the comfortable West are the ones who have the most problems with God, when we've had it so good? Interesting. Anyway, on the next slide. Haiti, 2010. At one fell swoop, 220,000 people died in the Haiti earthquake. And 1.3 million people were displaced in that Haiti earthquake. But what was fascinating was that on the Sunday, all these journalists had flown to Haiti to see the devastation, and all the journalists remarked on how astonishing it was that on the Sunday, churches were packed. On the next slide, there weren't buildings for people to meet in, and so they just met in the open air, and they sang and clapped, danced and prayed and worshipped God in the place where 220,000 people just died like that. And actually, all the churches reported massive growth after the earthquake. Just in the Baptist churches alone, in the month after the Haiti earthquake, there were 40,000 new baptisms, 40,000 new people saying they wanted to become Christians. Actually, suffering made them run to God, not away from God. That's interesting, don't you think? Our knee-jerk reaction, suffering, therefore we run away from God or shake our fist, that's not the way that so many people around the world respond when suffering hits. I just think that's interesting. On the next slide. Why is there so much bad in the world? We need to think about how we are asking that question. Are we in the philosophy department? Are we just having a chat with a mate? Are we really going through suffering at the moment? Because the answers we give will be different. Are we in the comfortable West? Are we in the rest of the world? All the answers that we give to this question will be massively different depending on all those things. But the other thing that we need to say about the suffering question is on the next slide. Let's set up the thing. Let's set up the story. In John chapter 11, this is where I always go when I think about this question of suffering. I go to this story in John's Gospel of suffering. Jesus has this friend called Lazarus. Lazarus is sick. He's at death's door. He's on his deathbed. And his sisters go and tell Jesus, can you come to our hometown and can you come and heal Lazarus and stop him from dying? Okay, that's the story. Jesus, can you do this good thing? Please, can you do this good thing and prevent this suffering? John chapter 11 verse 5, Jesus loved Martha and her sister Mary and Lazarus, yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Now that's kind of our question, isn't it? Right there. Jesus, can you help? Yeah, Jesus can help. Does he? No. He stays and Lazarus dies. And Jesus allows a terrible thing to happen when he could have prevented it. Okay? I think this story is really interesting. And we'll unpack how this story shows us about this suffering question. On the next slide. Jesus approaches the 2 different sisters in really different ways. Jesus goes to Martha, and Martha says to him, this is after Lazarus has died. Lazarus has been sick, he's died. Jesus comes late. It's now a funeral. And there they are at the funeral, and Jesus is meeting with Martha, the older sister. She says, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Next slide. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. So here is Martha, and she's really sad. Her brother has just died. She's facing suffering. And kind of what she needs is some truth. So Jesus gives her some Bible truth to lay hold of and to say, look, I am the resurrection and the life. Do you believe this? You need to get this truth in your head, and that will help you through suffering. That's what Martha needs, and so that's what Jesus gives to her. And maybe some of you are sitting here and you just want to get your head around the suffering question. And maybe you need more of a Martha answer. You need to know how the truth makes sense of things. Well, Jesus gives Martha truth. But then he meets her sister, Mary. And on the next slide, Mary asks Jesus the very same question that Martha did. Martha was objecting. Martha said, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Mary says the same thing. Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But Jesus does not answer Mary the same way. What does he do in verse 33? When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. It's interesting, isn't it? Martha gets a Bible study. Martha gets all this truth. Mary, Jesus doesn't download a whole bunch of truths on her because she's not in that place. Don't you love Jesus? He knows how to deal with people in different scenarios, okay? And with Mary, he doesn't just say, well, here's the same truth that I told to Martha because there's one way of answering the suffering question. Jesus comes and he just cries with her. It's amazing, isn't it? He gives Martha truth. He gives Mary tears. And maybe you need to wrap your head around this truth about suffering, or maybe you just need to know that Jesus cries with you. Maybe you just need to know that. There is a God who weeps with you, who weeps for you. There's a verse in the Old Testament book of Isaiah. It says, in all our suffering, God too suffers. It says, in all our affliction, God too is afflicted. And this is one truth that we need to get a hold of. That there are tears from heaven. It's not as though God is cold and indifferent and saying, ha, you're suffering. Look at Jesus and realize He's got the truth that you need. He's also got the tears that you need. So on the next slide, how are we asking the question? Are we wanting truth? Are we wanting tears? Are we in the West? Are we in the rest? How are we asking the question? Another thing we need to think about is which God are we talking about when we ask this question? Next slide. Which God are we talking about? Maybe some of you do religious education. Some of you do RE or something at school. Yeah, a little bit. Have you heard sort of definitions of God at school? You know, God is, what is it? Omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent. He's omnivorous, isn't he? He's ambidextrous. He's trifocal. He's double jointed. He's all these, he's all these things. And it can kind of feel like a game, can't it? At this point, kind of, when people start to define God as though He's like the omni-being, yeah, it can feel like a game that someone's just dreamt up this perfect being. Christians aren't into playing the game that the philosophers play. When we want to know who God is, what do? We look to Jesus. And on the next slide, we see the picture that Jesus gives to us of God is not of this distant, aloof individual who is kind of pristine and immune from all suffering. When you look at Jesus, you see the greatest sufferer there's ever been. When you see Jesus, you see someone who's plunged down into our suffering, and on the cross, He's taken hell for us. You see someone who knows all about suffering. So for the Christian, when the Christian thinks, how do God and suffering go together? Well, we look at Jesus and we see the suffering God. Okay? Now, suffering does rule out a lot of gods. There are a lot of gods out there who have never suffered. There are a lot of gods out there who cannot suffer and who are immune from all that kind of stuff. And of course, suffering rules them out. But suffering cannot rule out the suffering God, can it? How can you not believe in this God because of suffering? Well, this God is the suffering God. Suffering and God do go together according to Jesus. But what I want to do is I want to tell you to cling on to this God, this Jesus. Because without this Jesus, suffering doesn't make any sense at all. On the next slide, without this God, this Jesus, suffering becomes natural and it becomes hopeless. Okay? You might think, I don't like God because this world is so full of suffering, I'm going to get rid of God. All of a sudden, if that's what you say, all of a sudden you've just made all suffering natural and you've made it all hopeless. Let me show you how you've made it all natural. On the next slide, Richard Dawkins famously said this once. He said, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Okay? He's an atheist and he says, look, there's no goodness behind this universe at all. When you look at nature red in tooth and claw and you look at all the suffering and the bleeding and the death, that's all there is. There's no goodness or evil behind that. There's no God. There's no heaven or hell. There's nothing to say whether that's right or wrong. It's just stuff that happens. And Richard Dawkins doesn't think suffering is evil. He doesn't think anything ultimately is evil. Because at the end of the day, the universe just is. And it just happens to be unpleasant if you are in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Richard Dawkins can't call suffering wrong. It's not wrong according to him. He can't get upset about suffering. A Christian really can get upset about suffering. A Christian can call it wrong. A Christian can get angry about suffering. On the next slide, we see what Jesus does. Next slide. Jesus comes in and he says it's not natural. Next slide. When he comes to Lazarus' tomb, he's deeply moved in spirit and he's troubled and he weeps. He gets angry at death and he cries because he's saying suffering's not natural. Okay, it should not be. It's not just one of those things. Jesus has come into this world to reverse evil and to say it's not right. Don't make your peace with suffering because it's not right. It's not natural. But it's not hopeless either. That's the other thing, that if you get rid of God, you lose all hope. Suddenly, you don't have a God to help you through your suffering, but you don't have any hope beyond your suffering either, do you? If Stephen Fry is right, and he's right to get really angry at bone cancer. The trouble is he can't really be angry at bone cancer. He just has to say it's one of those things. And the great problem is, if Stephen Fry is right, bone cancer wins. If Stephen Fry is right, then that parasite that burrows out of the eye wins. Death wins. Destruction wins. Chaos wins. Nothingness wins. The universe just flings out into heat death. We all die. The sun explodes. It's over. Suffering wins if Stephen Fry is right. There's nothing harder to bear than hopeless suffering. So let me urge you, don't get rid of this God in the midst of your suffering, because if you do, on the next slide, if you do, you get rid of your ability to be angry at the suffering and you get rid of your hope. But here's the hope. Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Jesus actually conquers the grave. And a few weeks after he does this, he rises out of his own tomb. And what he does is, Jesus is like the needle that goes through the black shroud of death and out the other side. And he wants to get connected to you. And if you're connected to him, then like thread is connected to the needle, he wants to pull you through that same suffering and out the other side into a true hope. With this God, suffering is not natural and it's not hopeless. So next slide. Not natural, not hopeless. But you might still want to ask, where did it come from? Where did all this suffering come from? The Bible says that in the beginning, there was light and life and love. Stephen Fry is wrong. God did not create evil. He did not create evil. No Christian thinks God created evil. He created a good world. But we have turned from the light. And when you turn from the light, where else do you go but the darkness? When you turn from love, where else do you go but into hatred? When you turn from life, where else do you go but into death and destruction? And we've turned to that way. And rather than prevent us from turning, God has pursued us into the darkness in order to win us, in order to take that suffering himself and to lead us through. But you might think, well, why doesn't Jesus today end my suffering? Is that on the next slide? Why doesn't Jesus stop it today? And that returns us to that verse on the next slide. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Now it's interesting, isn't it? Jesus could have just healed Lazarus. Instead, he raises Lazarus. But that's what he wants to do with the whole world. Next slide. Jesus doesn't just repair the world, he resurrects it. That's what he wants to do. Take it through death and out the other side. We always pray to God, and it's right to do this. It's totally right to do this. Lord, I've had this diagnosis. And Lord, it doesn't look good. Please, can I have another 10 years of life? And maybe God would be kind and say, okay, you can have another 10 years of life. Well, then what? Another 10 years? Can I pray for another 10 years? And then another 10 years? Will I live till I'm 90, 100, 110, 120, 130, 140, 150? At what stage does God actually let me die and raise me up to the feasting joy that we were talking about yesterday? At what stage does he stop just repairing this suffering world and actually let us pass through that death and into the feasting joy that is promised? Jesus, he talked about earthquakes just before he died. In Matthew chapter 13, he calls earthquakes birth pains. Not death throes, birth pains. And through the pain, somehow, birth, new life. I don't know what a resurrected Haiti will look like, but the Bible promises it. I don't know what it will look like to have the suffering of this world transformed and raised up and made into something even greater and more glorious, but Jesus has promised it. I don't know what he'll do with your suffering, but I do know this. I know he will walk with you through it. He will give you the truth that you need. He will cry with you. He will give you the tears that you need. And He will take you through ultimate suffering. He'll take you through death and into feasting joy. Without this Jesus, you don't even have the right to be angry at suffering. Because without this God, suffering is just one of those things that happens. Without this God, you suffer, but you suffer alone and you suffer without hope. With this God, you have all the hope in the world. Let's just finish on the next slide. Stephen Fry. What would I say to Stephen Fry? Well, on the next slide, he gets some things right. Suffering is wrong. We should get angry. We should get angry at bone cancer. We really should. Jesus was angry at the tomb of Lazarus. He was about to raise Lazarus. He was about to see him alive again in a few minutes, but a few minutes of death are too much for Jesus. He gets angry. He cries. We should get angry at suffering. Suffering is wrong. And he talks about God as the creator of evil, and the creator of evil is a monster. Well, according to the Bible, actually, Satan is the author of all evil, and we should get angry at him. The author of evil is a monster. Stephen Fry gets this absolutely right, but on the next slide, here's what he gets wrong. At the end, we're not going to be standing face to face, eyeball to eyeball with God and telling him, what did you do about this? And how dare you do X, Y, and Z? We need to understand who we are with this God. We need to understand the true God. The true God is actually Jesus, the suffering God. Okay? The suffering God. We need to understand our tragic fall. And we need to understand our triumphant future. And when we understand all those things, then we can be angry. We can be angry at suffering, but we can have a hope beyond it. Let me leave it there. And shall I ask first if there are questions coming out of that? Otherwise, we'll go to the phone and the texted questions.
Thanks, Glenn. First of all, just picking up one from yesterday, which there was the question yesterday, if we're dead, how do we make new lives? And there was some discussion as to quite what that meant. The person's clarified and said, basically, if we're dead, how is it possible for us to make life, as in having children, if we're dead, basically?
Yeah. Okay. And so I was saying that you can be biologically alive, you can have a pulse, but you can not have life in the true sense. You're not connected to God. Okay? So it's possible to have a pulse, but not be connected to God. And in that sense, you're dead. Yeah? You've got a pulse, and you look alive, but you're actually dead. And as someone with a pulse, you can still have kids. Yeah? But no one, just because they're born into this world and has a pulse, that doesn't mean they have true life. It doesn't mean they're actually connected to God by faith. So lots of people can have kids even though they're dead, right? Because the way I'm using dead is being disconnected from God. Not having a relationship with God, in the Bible's terms, that means a really spiritual death. But you can be physically alive and have kids. Does that make sense? Hope that makes sense. Cool.
A couple of questions quite similar. Why did God create the tree of knowledge and good and evil if he knew there would be pain for us?
Okay. I think it's the one opportunity that Adam and Eve have in the whole world to say, we love you, God, and we trust you. It's the one opportunity. Because basically they can go anywhere and do anything. They are kings and queens of creation. They're made for each other. They've got the world at their feet. And they're living in the most law-free environment the world has ever known. But because if there were absolutely no rules, then there'd be no way for them to say, we distrust you, God. And so, by parallel, there's no way for them to say, we do trust you. So, having this one thing, and it's not even one thing that they have to do, it's one thing they just have to not do. It's the easiest thing in the world, but it's the one opportunity for them to be able to say, we trust you, God, or we don't trust you. And, God wants us to love him, to trust him. Not simply to be forced into a relationship with him, but to freely want to have that relationship with him. And so there was that opportunity for them to say no. And we took that opportunity. But in taking that opportunity, that of course, if you turn from light, it means embracing darkness. There can be no other way.
Why is hell and the devil created?
Hell is created as a punishment for the devil and his angels. That's what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 25. So hell is where God's anger is at all that is wrong. And Satan leading that rebellion, his place is hell. So properly speaking, in Matthew 25, the devil and his fallen angels, the demons, they're the ones who deserve hell and are going to hell. So often we get pictures of devils in pitchforks as though they are the ones who are poking everyone else in hell. Actually, they're not the jailers in hell. They're the ones being punished. And really, hell should only be the place of punishment for them. But tragically, people follow them into hell. We've been made for the kingdom. Again, that's what Matthew 25 says. The kingdom of feasting joy is for humanity, and hell is for the devil. The big tragedy is that people would ever refuse this God of light and instead choose the darkness. And at that stage, that's what hell is.
Why was I born into a good family in a good place and not into a place and a family that suffers?
It's a really good question. And it's really good to think in those terms, isn't it? Because like I was saying about Stephen Fry being very privileged and Woody Allen being very privileged, come on, I'm very privileged. We're all very privileged. If we're sitting in this room, we are like in the top, whatever percent of most affluent people who have ever lived on the face of this planet. And so we should be really, really grateful for the blessings that we've had. And we should also realize that those to whom much is being given, much is expected. Jesus teaches that we've been given so much. Actually, what Jesus wants us to do with the so much that we have is to serve the lowest, serve the most suffering. Because that's what Jesus does. Jesus, he is the Son of God. He's the Prince of Heaven. He's got the world at his feet. What does he do with all his privilege? Actually, he comes down into a suffering world to bring help and healing and rescue. And if you want to follow Jesus, that's what we should do. We have a lot of privileges here in the West. And maybe one thing that you could be doing is to be praying, okay, Jesus, you've given me this privilege. Thank you. Thank you so much. How can I use this privilege to actually serve others? Because that's the way that Jesus wants us to use our privileges, to actually serve those who are less fortunate.
If you were to meet Stephen Fry, what would you say to him?
I think the first thing to say would be some of that stuff about, are you going through personal suffering at the moment, or are you just asking this as a philosophical question? Because if you're just asking it as a philosophical question, you would fail GCSE religious studies. You would. I mean, your argument doesn't work. So if he's asking it from a philosophical point of view, then I'd take him on those terms. But if he knows a family where they've just lost a child to bone cancer, my answer is going to be hugely different at that stage. And I think one of the first things to do is just to say, your hatred and the anger that you have against suffering, that is good, that is right, that is God-given. But actually, C.S. Lewis, the guy who wrote the Narnia books, he became a Christian when he was in exactly Stephen Fry's shoes. He was getting really angry about evil and suffering. And he was an atheist. He was a total atheist because how can God allow so much suffering in the world? But he started to think a bit more. He said, well, why am I getting angry? Why shouldn't the world be full of suffering if there's no God? If there's no God, if there's no ultimate goodness in the world, then how can I call anything else bad or wrong or out of place? If there's no ultimate goodness in the world, then suffering just is, and there's nothing wrong about it. And he gave this illustration. He said, imagine you had never ever seen such a thing as a straight line. Never in your experience had you ever seen a straight line. Every line that you'd ever seen is always wavy. Well, at that point, no line is wavy because you only know wavy as opposed to a straight line, yeah? Lines are just lines if you don't have the straight line. And what he's saying is, God is like this straight line of goodness who is all goods and the last word in this world is going to be goodness. We look at this wavy world, this world that's out of kilter, and everything's messy. But we only know that it's messy if we've got some idea of goodness. And God is that good thing that allows us to say, hey, suffering's not right. It's wrong and we should rail against it. C.S. Lewis actually became a Christian when he started to have exactly the same thoughts as Stephen Fry had. So I would not at all give up hope on Stephen Fry, and I would want to talk to him about these sorts of things, because many people have started to have the sorts of thoughts that he's had and ended up as great believers in Jesus. So I'd want to have those sorts of chats with him.
Why does God demand the death of so many innocent people in the Bible? And there's a few examples here. So Exodus 35:2, God demands that we kill everyone who works on the Sabbath day, or Deuteronomy 21:18-21. God demands that we kill girls who are not virgins when they marry.
I'd have to check that one. Yeah, but the law in the Old Testament was always set up as a condemning example of what would happen if you made a people live under the pure goodness and justice of God. And we can't do it, not even for a second. Now, very, very few of the law's demands do we ever see actually lived out in the execution of these sinners. But we're being taught all throughout the Old Testament that rebellion against God equals death. And it ought to equal death. And that shouldn't surprise us. That should just be a matter of pure logic. If God is the source of life, and you want to be free of God, you want to be free of life, right? To go against God is, of course it demands death. In the Old Testament, they had a very harsh system it was God's goodness, but that God's goodness was pressing down on them in every aspect of their life and showing them up as those who don't have goodness in themselves. And that just shows us, how much we absolutely need Jesus. We absolutely need Jesus to come and save us, not only from the suffering that's out there, but also the badness that's in my own heart. If the person wants to talk to me more about that, I'd be very happy to keep chatting afterwards.
Running out of time, so there's a couple of questions. I want to finish with this one here. Someone's asked a good question about global warming. They might want to talk to you about that afterwards, but I thought this would be a good one to end on. Yeah. How do you know if you are a Christian?
How do you know if you are a Christian? I've been saying that being a Christian is having a connection with Jesus. And when we're connected to Jesus, then we're in the family. He's the Son of God. We get His Father as our Father. We get His Spirit as our Spirit. We have His eternal life forevermore. How do you get connected to Jesus? The Bible says by faith, by trusting, by believing Jesus. And probably the simplest test is to do something like open up John's Gospel. I've been talking a lot about John's Gospel. It's the fourth biography of Jesus. John says, I've written my Gospel so that you might believe. So read through it. And what you see is John just kind of paints these pictures of Jesus. And if you believe him, you start to say, He's Lord. He's ultimate. He's tops. He's amazing. He's great. He's the one. He is what God looks like. And when you start saying that about Jesus, you found yourself believing. Yeah? Faith comes by hearing the message. And so we open up the scriptures, we come to church, we come to youth group, we hear again and again about Jesus. And at some point, the lights go on, and you say, Jesus, He's awesome, He's great. Oh, bang, you're a Christian, okay? You're a Christian. Don't look into yourself in order to figure out, do I have enough faith? What are my believing feelings like? Are my believing feelings strong enough to be saved? Don't look within to have faith. Look out to Jesus. And as you look out and see what He's like, if you come to the point of saying He's Lord, He is God come to earth, He's ultimate, He's tops, He's amazing. If you say Jesus is Lord, you're a Christian. Simple as that. If you want proof of that, Romans 10 verse 9 says exactly that. But that's how you become a Christian, and how you know you're a Christian is you keep on looking at Jesus and you keep on thinking, yeah, He's awesome. He's the one. He's the one. And Jesus promises that anyone who comes to Him, He will never drive away. You are one with Him forever.